The afternoon sun clung stubbornly to the rooftops of Riverton, Wyoming, its golden rays flickering across quiet streets where children's bicycles leaned against chain-link fences. September 18th, 2001, seemed unremarkable, another small-town evening, the kind where you could still hear the whistle of the Wind River breeze drifting across empty playgrounds. At 5 p.m., 11-year-old Rachel Monroe was spotted on her porch, her blonde hair catching the light as she laughed, tugging playfully at her little dog's leash. It was the kind of fleeting image neighbors remembered later with painful clarity, the innocence of a child against the backdrop of a fading day. But as the hours slipped by, that warmth dissolved into something darker. A classmate, Chloe, recalled seeing Rachel walking toward the park, her pink backpack bouncing behind her with every step. Another woman noticed a green pickup circling the block, moving slowly, deliberately, like a predator tracing its prey. By 7:30 p.m., when Rachel's mother and brother returned home, the evening had transformed into horror. The front door hung slightly ajar. The dog barked frantically into the emptiness, and Rachel, once so vividly present, was simply gone. In Riverton, a town where people left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors without question, the disappearance shattered more than just a family. It marked the beginning of a mystery that would fester for decades. A wound no vigil, no search party, no whispered prayer seemed able to close. Someone had taken Rachel Monroe into the shadows. Someone who had been bold enough to circle the neighborhood in plain sight. And someone who thought the truth could stay buried forever. Before we dive onto this case, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Also like this video. Now back to the case.
The late afternoon sun draped Riverton, Wyoming in that honey-colored light only early fall can bring. On September 18, 2001, the day had felt almost uneventful. The sky was clear, the air crisp, the sounds of the Wind River Range carried faintly into town like a whisper of nature's steady rhythm. Neighbors prepared for dinner, kids pedaled their bikes down cracked sidewalks, and the Monroe home on a quiet street seemed like any other in the neighborhood. On the front porch, 11-year-old Rachel Monroe sat with her little dog Daisy, its tail wagging furiously as it tugged at a worn leash. Rachel's blonde hair shimmered in the last rays of sunlight. To anyone passing by, she looked like a picture of childhood innocence, carefree, safe, anchored by the promise of home. Mrs. Jensen, the elderly neighbor who kept a sharp eye on the block, waved from across the street. "Don't let Daisy run off, sweetheart," she called. Rachel's laughter answered her, ringing bright in the quiet air. But someone else was watching. A green pickup truck drove slowly past the Monroe house, circled the block once, then again. Its engine rattled faintly, its pace too deliberate to be casual. Chloe, one of Rachel's classmates, would later say she saw her friend walking toward the park just a few blocks away, her pink backpack bouncing with each step. Behind her, the same green truck idled near the curb, its presence like a shadow in daylight. By the time the sun dipped behind the mountains, the street fell still. At 7:30 p.m., Rachel's mother and brother returned home. The porch light glowed, but the scene was wrong. The front door was cracked open. Daisy barked frantically, his leash trailing loose on the steps. Rachel's pink backpack, the one she'd been carrying, was nowhere to be seen. Inside the house, silence pressed heavy. No giggles, no chatter, no sound of footsteps on the floorboards, just absence. For the Monroe family, that evening marked the beginning of a nightmare. For Riverton, it was the moment innocence was ripped away, leaving behind a wound that would fester for 20 years. No one could know it then, but the circling truck, the backpack, the barking dog, these fragments would become the echoes of a story buried deep in time, waiting for science and persistence to force the truth back into the light. The cold open leaves us with a chilling image, the porch light burning over an empty doorway, a dog barking into the void, and the shadow of a predator moving silently through a small Wyoming town. The evening of September 18th, 2001, seemed unremarkable at first. The Monroe family's small wooden house on the edge of Riverton sat in its usual calm, the porch light flickering against the weathered siding. Rachel Monroe, an 11-year-old with boundless curiosity and a laugh that neighbors swore could brighten the gloomiest day, had been playing with her dog Daisy on the front porch. Her mother and older brother had gone to the grocery store, leaving Rachel at home for what should have been a short, uneventful hour. At around 5:15 p.m., Rachel's classmate Chloe saw her walking toward the park just 3 blocks away, a pink backpack swinging against her shoulders. Chloe waved, but Rachel seemed preoccupied, glancing now and again behind her. Chloe noticed something else, too. A green pickup idling at the corner, its headlights dim, as if trying not to be noticed. It rolled forward slowly, keeping its distance. Chloe thought little of it in that moment. It was a neighborhood where trucks were as common as bicycles, but the image would later burn itself into her memory. Mrs. Jensen, the elderly neighbor across the street, recalled Rachel standing near the curb a short time later, Daisy tugging at the leash. She was smiling, Mrs. Jensen would later tell police, but then her face turned serious, like she heard something. A few minutes after that, the dog barked sharply. Mrs. Jensen assumed Rachel had gone inside. She didn't think to look again until much later. As dusk fell, the quiet streets began to empty. The playground at the park still held a scattering of children, but none saw Rachel arrive. Somewhere between her front porch and those swings, she disappeared. No one heard a scream, no one saw a struggle, no one could say for certain if she even reached the park gates. It was as if the path had swallowed her whole. When her mother and brother returned at 7:30 p.m., the first sign that something was wrong was the open front door. Daisy barked with urgency, circling in the yard, his leash dragging behind him. The house was silent. Rachel's mother called her daughter's name, first with impatience, then with fear. No answer. She checked Rachel's room. Bed empty, backpack missing, jacket still hanging on the chair. The realization came slowly, but with crushing weight. Rachel was gone. Within minutes, neighbors gathered on the street, drawn by the frantic shouts. Flashlights flickered on as people searched bushes, sheds, and backyards. Chloe nervously told Rachel's mother about seeing her near the park. Mrs. Jensen added what she'd seen, the strange circling of the green pickup. The police were called at 8 p.m., and by nightfall the small neighborhood had become the center of a desperate search. Officers fanned out with flashlights, scouring the nearby fields and the edges of the Wind River. Parents held their children closer, pulling them inside, whispering that something unthinkable had just occurred. But the strangest part was what wasn't there. There were no tire tracks leading away from the Monroe house, no scattered belongings in the yard, no sign of forced entry inside. Rachel's pink backpack, so distinctive, was gone, leaving investigators with almost nothing to anchor their search. That night, Rachel's mother sat on the porch steps, Daisy pressed close against her, sobbing into the Wyoming night. The porch light illuminated an empty doorway, and the community understood that a child had slipped through their fingers in the span of a few hours. It was a night that would never leave Riverton, and for 20 years every retelling would come back to the same haunting details: the pink backpack, the barking dog, and the green pickup that prowled too close.
The first 3 days after Rachel Monroe's disappearance were a blur of frantic motion and gnawing fear. In missing child cases, investigators know that the first 72 hours are critical, the period when the chances of recovery are highest. For Riverton, those hours would stretch like an eternity. Within an hour of the 911 call, the quiet street where Rachel lived became a hub of activity. Patrol cars lined the block, their red and blue lights washing across the faces of worried neighbors. Officers moved house to house, knocking on doors, asking the same urgent questions. Did you see Rachel? Did you notice a green pickup truck? Did anything unusual happen this evening? By midnight, the Fremont County Sheriff's Department had activated a full-scale search. Floodlights cut through the darkness as teams combed fields, ditches, and backyards. Bloodhounds from the state penitentiary were brought in, noses pressed to Rachel's jacket for her scent. The dogs pulled toward the park, then lost the trail near a gravel service road that fed out toward the highway. Helicopters circled overhead with spotlights, their beams sweeping across the quiet farmland. Search volunteers, many of them Rachel's classmates' parents, trudged through tall grass and sagebrush with flashlights, calling her name into the emptiness. "Rachel! Rachel, honey, can you hear us?" Their voices cracked in the cold night air, answered only by the rustling of the wind. Day 1 bled into Day 2. Posters with Rachel's school photo, her bright smile, her blonde hair tied back, were printed in hurried batches at the local copy shop and taped to storefronts, gas stations, and car windows. Volunteers stapled them to telephone poles, the ink already smudging from the morning dew. The photo was paired with her description: 11 years old, last seen wearing a pink backpack, light blue t-shirt, jeans. Detectives zeroed in on the mysterious green pickup truck. Witness statements described it circling the neighborhood that afternoon, sometimes driving too slowly, sometimes stopping at corners as if waiting. But no one had caught the license plate. No one could say whether it was an older model or newer, just that it was green and out of place. Inside the Monroe house, investigators searched for signs of forced entry. None were found. The door ajar suggested someone might have lured Rachel out rather than barged in. The computer was checked, phone records pulled, her school locker opened. Nothing revealed a reason for her sudden disappearance. Meanwhile, the emotional weight of those hours was crushing. Rachel's mother clutched her daughter's favorite sweater as officers asked her to recount every detail of the day. Her brother, only a few years older, sat silent on the couch, staring at the floor, unable to speak. Friends and relatives streamed in with casseroles and coffee, but food went untouched. The house, once noisy with Rachel's laughter, felt hollow, as if sound itself refused to linger there. By the third day, the media had arrived. Satellite trucks parked along the street. Reporters asked questions with cameras rolling, pushing microphones toward tearful family members. A deputy sheriff stepped in, holding a press conference under the glaring lights. He emphasized their commitment. "We are treating this as an active abduction investigation. Every resource available is being used." Still, whispers of fear grew louder. Parents kept their children indoors, locking doors that had once remained open. The green pickup became a ghostly presence in conversations, described in hushed tones at grocery stores and coffee shops. Some feared it would return. Others wondered if it already had. At the close of the 72 hours, the search had expanded 10 miles outward from Rachel's home. Planes flew grid patterns over the Wind River Basin. Dive teams checked irrigation ditches and ponds. Yet Rachel remained missing. No backpack, no shoe, no piece of evidence except for the open door, the barking dog, and the vague memory of a truck circling where it didn't belong.
By the fourth day, the green pickup had become more than a detail in witness statements. It had become the obsession of an entire town. Riverton residents whispered about it in line at the post office, speculated about it over coffee at the diner, and passed theories like wildfire. The idea of a stranger circling the block, hunting for a child, carried both a chilling simplicity and the lure of explanation. Then came a breakthrough, or what seemed like one. A mechanic at a local auto shop reported seeing a dented dark green Ford parked outside late on the evening Rachel vanished. The driver, a man in his mid-30s with a scruffy beard, had paid cash for repairs and left quickly. The description was just specific enough to ignite the investigation. Detectives traced the truck to a man named Tommy Garrison, a local drifter with a record of petty theft and drug use. Tommy lived on the edge of town in a trailer surrounded by rusted car parts, the kind of setting that matched the community's worst fears. Rumors grew with each retelling, that he had been seen watching children at the park, that he had once been arrested for prowling, that his green truck had a reputation of its own. Police acted fast. They interviewed Garrison, searched his trailer, and seized his pickup. News traveled faster than fact. By evening, neighbors were gathered along the fence lines, whispering that Rachel's abductor had been caught. Reporters camped outside his property, cameras rolling as deputies hauled away the truck on a flatbed tow. The town exhaled at least for a moment. The narrative fit too neatly. A troubled man with the right vehicle, living on the margins, already distrusted. Parents felt reassured enough to let their children play outside again. Rachel's family clung to the possibility of answers, however grim. But as investigators combed through the truck, the illusion cracked. Forensics turned up no trace of Rachel. No hair, no fibers, no fingerprints beyond Garrison's own. His alibi, shaky at first, hardened under scrutiny. A girlfriend confirmed he was at her house during the critical hours. Surveillance footage from a convenience store placed him there just after 7 p.m. Still, suspicion lingered. Detectives questioned him again and again, hoping pressure might shake something loose. Garrison's frustration mounted. "I didn't even know that little girl," he snapped during one session. "You all just see a green truck and decide I'm the monster." His words rang with anger, but also with a wounded truth. Meanwhile, the media had already crucified him. Headlines blared, "Green truck owner questioned in Rachel Monroe case." Talk radio speculated on his guilt as if it were already proven. Strangers shouted at him in grocery store parking lots, calling him a kidnapper. The town had found its villain, and even as the evidence faltered, the narrative refused to let go. For Rachel's family, the days spent watching the investigation collapse into a dead end were devastating. Her mother, once hopeful, now felt trapped in an endless cycle of hope and betrayal. Every time the sheriff's office called, her heart leapt, only to crash when they admitted again that nothing tied Garrison to Rachel's disappearance. By the end of the second week, the sheriff's department had no choice but to release him and return his truck. The green pickup that once carried the town's collective rage now sat in his yard, its presence a bitter reminder of how quickly suspicion can warp into certainty. But the damage had already been done. Garrison was marked, a man forever linked in whispers to Rachel's disappearance, even as investigators conceded there was no case against him. For the community, the collapse of the green truck theory left something worse than fear. It left uncertainty. If not him, then who? And if the answer wasn't in plain sight, did that mean the real predator was still out there, blending in, watching, waiting? The red herring had burned precious time, drained resources, and shattered fragile trust between investigators and townspeople. What had felt like progress turned out to be nothing more than a mirage. And Rachel Monroe was still gone. The collapse of the green truck investigation didn't just return Riverton to uncertainty. It fractured the fragile bond between the community and the sheriff's department. What had been a story of swift progress now looked, to many, like incompetence or worse, a desperate attempt to scapegoat an easy target. By early October 2001, frustration boiled over. Town hall meetings grew tense as parents demanded answers. "If it wasn't him, then where are you looking?" One mother shouted, her voice cracking as she clutched her child's hand. Another accused the department of wasting time chasing shadows while the real kidnapper roamed free. The sheriff, usually composed, struggled to reassure the public without admitting how little they actually had. The media fanned the flames. Regional outlets from Casper and Cheyenne descended on Riverton, parking their satellite vans outside the sheriff's office. Nightly broadcasts replayed the same grainy shots of Rachel's smiling school photo, paired with footage of deputies searching fields or dragging the river. Headlines turned accusatory. Investigation stalls after truck suspect cleared. And is Riverton safe? For Rachel's family, the spotlight was unbearable. Her mother, once cooperative with reporters, began refusing interviews, retreating behind drawn curtains. Her brother, just 14, was followed by cameras on his way to school, microphones shoved in his face with cruel questions. "Do you think she's still alive?" The Monroes became both victims and unwilling public figures, their grief dissected on talk shows and in newsprint. Rumors only made the pain sharper. Some neighbors speculated that the family knew more than they were saying. A cruel theory emerged that Rachel had run away and the Monroes were covering it up. Others whispered about custody disputes, secret boyfriends, or debts, all baseless, but whispered loudly enough to wound. Grief twisted into isolation as friends they had once trusted grew distant, unsure what to believe. Meanwhile, the pressure on detectives grew unbearable. Every misstep was amplified. When a search of an abandoned barn turned up nothing, critics asked why it had taken weeks to look there in the first place. When deputies followed a lead to Colorado, the press mocked them for chasing ghosts. Inside the department, morale dipped. Some officers confessed to feeling hunted themselves, as if they were suspects in their own investigation. Still, investigators pressed forward, re-interviewing witnesses and chasing new tips, though many led nowhere. The problem wasn't just the absence of evidence, it was the presence of noise. The hotline rang constantly with people offering visions, dreams, or stories they had heard secondhand. For every genuine lead, 10 were wild goose chases, draining time and energy, and yet beneath the outrage, a deeper fear settled into Riverton. Parents stopped letting their children walk to school. Halloween was canceled that year, porches dark and silent where once pumpkins had glowed. The playground where Rachel was last seen lay empty, swings rattling in the Wyoming wind like relics of another life. The community's image of itself, as a safe, tight-knit town, was unraveling. The Monroes, crushed under the weight of grief and public scrutiny, tried to keep Rachel's memory alive. They held candlelight vigils on the courthouse steps, hundreds gathering with flickering flames to sing hymns and pray for her return. For a moment, those vigils brought unity, light against the darkness. But even there, reporters lingered, cameras capturing tears that would be replayed endlessly on the evening news. By winter, the case had become less about finding Rachel and more about the failure to do so. The sheriff's department, battered by criticism, quietly scaled back the search. For Riverton, hope was dimming. For Rachel's family, the silence was suffocating. The media frenzy would eventually fade, as all news cycles do. But the scars it left on the Monroes and their town would linger far longer. And in the quiet that followed, Rachel Monroe's absence became even more unbearable, an unsolved wound, raw and unhealed. By the spring of 2002, the search for Rachel Monroe had quietly shifted from frantic urgency to weary endurance. The sheriff's office, once buzzing with daily press conferences, now sat quieter, its evidence board cluttered with faded maps, photographs, and dead-end leads. The Monroes felt the shift long before it was official. Phone calls from detectives came less frequently. The updates that had once offered fragile hope dwindled into vague reassurances. "We're still working it, ma'am." Candlelight vigils still drew neighbors, but fewer each time, the crowd shrinking as life inevitably pulled people back into their own routines. For Rachel's mother, the silence felt like betrayal. In August 2002, less than a year after Rachel's disappearance, the case was formally designated a cold case. The announcement wasn't dramatic, just a short press release noting that active leads had been exhausted, but the file remained open for future review. Yet to the Monroes, the phrase struck like a hammer. Cold, frozen, as if Rachel's memory could be packed away into a filing cabinet. The label carried a weight the family hadn't expected. For months, they had lived with the hope that an answer was just one phone call away, that the next tip or the next search might bring her home. Now, they faced the reality that Rachel's case was joining the silent backlog of unsolved crimes, suspended in limbo. The sheriff defended the decision as practical. "We can't keep burning resources on leads that aren't there," he told reporters, his voice weary. But the words landed poorly. To the community, it sounded like surrender. Parents who had once crowded town hall meetings now shook their heads in resignation. The fear remained, but the fight had drained out of them. For the Monroes, grief hardened into ritual. Rachel's room remained untouched, her bed neatly made, her pink backpack still leaning against the dresser. Each year on her birthday, they baked a cake, set a place for her at the table, and whispered prayers into the quiet. Her brother grew older, carrying a bitterness he rarely spoke aloud. Behind the scenes, the case file was placed into storage, joining dozens of others marked by unanswered questions. Detectives rotated out, promotions shifted priorities, and Rachel's name slowly faded from daily conversation. Only her family carried the weight constantly, each passing season a reminder of time lost. But the story was not over. What no one in Riverton could have known then was that technology itself would become the silent witness Rachel never had. And 2 decades later, it would thaw the coldest of cases, resurrecting secrets that had been buried, along with the hope of long-delayed justice. By 2020, nearly 2 decades had passed since Rachel Monroe's disappearance. For most in Riverton, the case had receded into memory, a tragic story often whispered about, but rarely revisited aloud. Yet inside the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation, a new generation of detectives was combing through dormant files, determined to test them against the advances of modern science. Rachel's case stood out. Among the evidence boxed away back in 2001 was her pink backpack, retrieved from a drainage ditch weeks after she vanished. At the time, investigators had found faint biological traces, minute flecks of skin cells, too degraded for the technology of the day. In 2001, it had been classified as inconclusive. In 2020, it became a lifeline. The evidence was shipped to a cutting-edge lab specializing in touch DNA and forensic genealogy. Unlike the crude analyses of the early 2000s, this process could generate a usable profile from microscopic fragments invisible to the naked eye. Weeks later, the lab confirmed what Riverton investigators had long suspected, but could never prove. The DNA did not belong to Rachel, nor to any family member. It belonged to an unknown male. That sliver of information cracked the silence wide open. Detectives uploaded the genetic profile into national databases, but it yielded no direct matches. Instead, they turned to forensic genealogy, cross-referencing distant relatives of the mystery contributor. Slowly, a family tree began to take shape, branching through generations of records, birth certificates, obituaries, marriage licenses, piece by piece. Investigators followed the branches until the lines narrowed to a single man who had once lived less than a mile from the Monroe home in 2001. He was not a drifter, not a shadowy figure passing through town, but someone who had been part of Riverton's daily fabric. The realization sent shivers through the task force. For years, the community had feared a faceless predator. Now the evidence pointed not to an outsider, but to someone who had walked the same streets, attended the same events, maybe even joined the same search parties when Rachel first vanished. For Rachel's family, the call from investigators was both devastating and renewing. After years of silence, someone was finally speaking her name with urgency again. The promise was not just that her case was remembered, but that it was now solvable, and with the genetic trail pointing squarely toward a man no one had ever suspected, the stage was set for Riverton's most shocking revelation. When the genealogical research narrowed to a single name, detectives felt an uneasy chill. The man was not some stranger who had drifted into Riverton and vanished without trace. He was someone the town had known for years, a man whose presence blended so seamlessly into the background that few had ever given him a second thought. His name was Calvin Brooks, a quiet middle-aged mechanic who, in 2001, lived just 3 streets over from the Monroe family. At the time, Calvin was 40, known around Riverton for his steady job at a local auto shop and his easy willingness to fix a neighbor's flat tire without asking for much more than a thank you. He wasn't a recluse, nor was he particularly social. He existed in that gray area of small-town life, familiar enough to be trusted, but never close enough to be truly known. In fact, when Rachel disappeared, Calvin had even joined one of the search parties that combed through fields outside Riverton. A photograph from a local newspaper showed him in a reflective vest, standing just a few rows behind Rachel's grieving uncle. At the time, nobody suspected a thing. He blended in, his head bowed like the others, his flashlight beam sweeping through tall grass. Detectives revisiting his history noticed unsettling patterns. Calvin had been questioned briefly in 2001, but only in the broad net cast over all local men. He had no criminal record beyond a few minor traffic violations. He lived alone in a small 1-story house shaded by cottonwoods. His green pickup truck, the same model and color described by Chloe, Rachel's classmate, was noted in the file but never pursued further after he claimed he'd been home that evening. His alibi, given by a cousin, had been accepted at face value in the frantic early days of the investigation. For years after Rachel's disappearance, Calvin remained in Riverton, He fixed cars, attended the occasional church service, and volunteered at the annual rodeo, where he worked the gates with quiet efficiency. Parents shook his hand. Children walked past him without fear. He was, in every sense, hiding in plain sight, but the DNA evidence dismantled the illusion. His genetic material had been found on Rachel's backpack, the very item she was last seen carrying. It was no longer speculation or circumstantial suspicion. Science had placed him in her orbit on the day she vanished. The thought unsettled investigators as they began to re-examine old photographs, old interviews, and even old community events. Had he attended candlelight vigils for Rachel? Had he nodded sympathetically at her mother while knowing the truth? The possibility gnawed at everyone who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him. Neighbors interviewed in 2021 expressed disbelief. "Calvin? He was just—" "There," one woman recalled. "He fixed my son's car. He waved when he drove by. I never once thought he could be capable of something like this." Others admitted there had always been something slightly off about him, a watchfulness in his eyes, but in a town where everyone knew everyone. Suspicion felt out of place. For Rachel's family, learning his name reopened a wound they had carried for 20 years. Her mother remembered him distinctly, the quiet man who had once stopped to pet Rachel's little dog on the porch. He had been close enough to notice her, close enough to insert himself into the rhythms of their lives. The idea that her daughter's abductor had been a familiar face, not a phantom stranger, made the betrayal feel sharper. By the end of 2021, Calvin Brooks was no longer just a name in a file. He was the prime suspect in a crime that had haunted Riverton for 2 decades. The task force's focus shifted to one pressing question: how to gather undeniable proof, enough to transform suspicion into an arrest that would withstand the weight of the courtroom. The answer would come not from witness testimony or faded memories, but from something far simpler, an everyday object discarded carelessly in public. By early 2022, the investigators knew that their genealogical trail pointed squarely toward Calvin Brooks. But genealogy alone wasn't enough to secure an arrest warrant. It narrowed the field, but it didn't prove direct involvement. What they needed was a fresh DNA sample, collected covertly, and compared against the profile extracted from Rachel Monroe's backpack. The task force assembled a plan that required patience, surveillance, and precision. Calvin was still living in Riverton, now in his early 60s. He worked part-time at the same auto shop, spent evenings at a nearby diner, and maintained the same solitary routines. Detectives rotated shifts, watching him quietly, tracking his movements without tipping him off. Weeks of observation revealed an opportunity. Calvin had a ritual of stopping at the diner every Thursday night for coffee and pie. He always sat in the same corner booth, sometimes reading a newspaper, sometimes just staring out the window. And every time, when he finished, he left behind the same thing: a white ceramic mug with his fingerprints smudged across the handle. His lips pressed to the rim, but investigators needed something disposable, something he wouldn't expect to be saved, something they could lawfully retrieve. They waited, night after night, hoping he would slip. One bitterly cold evening, the break finally came. Calvin ordered a slice of cherry pie to go, with a styrofoam cup of coffee for the road. As he walked out into the parking lot, he set the cup on the roof of his green pickup while fumbling for his keys. Minutes later, he drove off, forgetting the empty cup entirely. It rolled down the windshield and landed near the curb. 2 plainclothes officers moved quickly, retrieving the cup and placing it into an evidence bag. The collection was done legally, discreetly, without confrontation. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a forgotten piece of trash. But to the task force, it was the key to unlocking 20 years of silence. The cup was rushed to the state crime lab. Forensic analysts swabbed the rim, carefully extracting the trace of saliva left behind. Then came the agonizing wait, days stretching into weeks as machines processed, sequenced, and compared. Finally, the result appeared. The DNA from Calvin's discarded coffee cup was matched against the sample preserved from Rachel's backpack in 2001. The lines of data lined up perfectly, leaving no room for doubt. The report concluded with the words the investigators had longed to read: DNA profile matches 100%. The room fell silent when the call came in. Some detectives sat back, exhaling relief, while others clenched their fists, overcome with a mix of triumph and sorrow. For Rachel's mother, who received the news shortly after, The revelation was overwhelming. The man who had smiled at her, who had once patted her daughter's dog, who had walked unnoticed among the searchers, was the same man science now tied directly to her child's disappearance. For Riverton, the arrest was no longer a matter of if, but when. The suspect who had walked free for 2 decades was finally within reach. The next step would shatter the illusion of Calvin Brooks' quiet, unremarkable life and send shockwaves through the small Wyoming town that had once searched for Rachel with him standing in their midst. The confirmation from the lab left no doubt. The DNA taken from Calvin Brooks's discarded coffee cup and the DNA preserved from Rachel Monroe's backpack in 2001 were identical. The report contained the phrase investigators had waited 2 decades to see. DNA profile matches 100%. That single sentence broke open a case long thought frozen in time. For detectives who had worked in silence for months, the validation was electric, but it also carried a gravity none of them took lightly. They weren't just preparing to arrest a suspect. They were about to unmask someone who had lived among their community for 20 years, unsuspected, unchallenged. The task force convened with the Fremont County District Attorney, laying out the evidence, the genealogy, the backpack, the DNA. It was strong enough for a warrant, strong enough to bring a man who had lived in plain sight to stand before the law. On the morning of March 3, 2022, officers assembled outside Calvin's modest 1-story home. The cottonwoods in his yard were bare from winter, their branches etched against a pale sky. Neighbors peeked through curtains as unmarked vehicles quietly filled the street. Some assumed it was a drug raid. None expected that the man at the center of it was Calvin, the mechanic who fixed their cars, the quiet presence at church, the same man who once held a flashlight searching for Rachel. When the knock came, Calvin opened the door in a faded flannel shirt, confusion flickering across his face. "Mr. Brooks," the lead detective said, steady and clear, "you're under arrest for the kidnapping and murder of Rachel Monroe." The words seemed to freeze him. For a moment he didn't move, as if his mind was trying to rewrite reality. Then, with a resigned exhale, he lowered his head and allowed the officers to cuff him. He did not resist. He did not speak. The illusion of a quiet life collapsed in the span of seconds. News of the arrest tore through Riverton like wildfire. Phones rang, social media lit up, and within hours reporters were outside the courthouse, their cameras fixed on the man being led in shackles. Shock rippled through the community, not only because an arrest had finally been made, but because of who the suspect was. Calvin? "No way," one neighbor told a local station. "He was ordinary, just Calvin. He lived here his whole life. If you'd asked me yesterday, I'd have said he was the last person capable of this." Others admitted unease. "I always thought there was something off about him," a former co-worker said. "He'd stare too long, never quite smile right. But I never imagined this." For Rachel's family, the news brought an emotion difficult to name. Relief was tempered by grief, joy by the sting of betrayal. Her mother, in a tearful statement, said, "For 20 years, I wondered if anyone still remembered Rachel's name. Now I know the truth was waiting all along. She mattered. She still matters." The arrest was not just the end of an investigation. It was the shattering of an illusion. The man who had once walked among them at vigils, shaking hands, bowing his head in false solidarity, was the same man science had placed with Rachel in her final hours. In Riverton, where everyone knew everyone, the unmasking of Calvin Brooks was more than a crime solved. It was a betrayal of trust that left the town reeling and bracing for the revelations yet to come inside the interrogation room. The interrogation room at the Fremont County Sheriff's Office was sterile, its cinder-block walls painted a dull gray, the clock above the mirror ticking with a slow, deliberate beat. On the table sat a bottle of water untouched. Across from it, Calvin Brooks leaned back in his chair, his wrists bound in steel cuffs that clinked softly whenever he shifted. For hours, Calvin had maintained silence. He asked for no lawyer, requested no call. His posture was rigid, his jaw set, his eyes flickering between the detectives and the two-way mirror. It was as though he believed he could outweight them, just as he had outweighted justice for 20 years. Detective Mark Halstead, one of the veterans who had worked Rachel's case since the beginning, sat across from him. He had gray in his beard now, but his voice carried the same steady tone it had the night he first spoke to Rachel's mother. He slid a manila folder across the table, opening it just enough to let a few photographs spill out. Rachel's school picture, the search parties, the vigils. Finally, a photo of her pink backpack, dirt-stained but preserved after 2 decades underground. "You remember this, don't you?" Halstead said quietly. Calvin's eyes lingered on the image, his face betraying the smallest flicker of recognition before hardening again. "We've got your DNA," Halstead continued, his voice even. "From the strap of that backpack. From inside the lining. And we've got it from you twice. You can sit here all night, Calvin. That doesn't change the science." For a long moment, silence held the room. Then Calvin chuckled, a sound that was equal parts bitter and hollow. "Took you long enough," he muttered. It was the crack the detectives needed. Halstead leaned forward. "Tell us what happened. Tell us about Rachel." At first, Calvin spoke in fragments, each word sounding as if dragged out against his will. He admitted seeing Rachel that evening, admitted pulling up in his green pickup. He told them he offered her a ride, knowing her mother wasn't home, knowing the streets were quiet. "She trusted me," he said flatly. They all did. The detectives pressed gently, weaving between silence and confrontation. What emerged was a picture both chilling and devastating. Calvin had been watching Rachel for weeks. He knew her routine, knew when her mother left for work, knew when her brother went to baseball practice. That evening, he had waited for the right moment, then lured her into his truck under the guise of helping her with her backpack. The unreleased details, kept from the public for 2 decades, were difficult for investigators to hear. Calvin described driving her to a remote patch of land near the riverbank. He said Rachel had grown scared quickly, realizing something was wrong. She had tried to run. In the struggle, he struck her, harder than he intended. The admission chilled the room, but there was more. Calvin revealed something that stunned even the most seasoned detectives. The blood found on the inside of Rachel's backpack lining didn't come from her at all. It came from Calvin himself. In his rush and panic that night, he had cut his hand on a piece of metal inside his truck. That injury had left behind the DNA that years later, technology would transform into the noose around his neck. Detective Halstead sat back, the weight of the moment sinking in. The irony was unbearable. Calvin hadn't just been undone by Rachel's innocence, but by his own mistake. Sealed inside a child's school bag and buried in mud for 20 years. Calvin showed no tears, no remorse. He recited his story with a cold detachment, as though describing a broken part he had once tried to fix. When pressed about why he stayed in Riverton all these years, why he attended vigils and shook hands with Rachel's grieving mother, he offered a single chilling response. "It kept me invisible. Nobody suspects the man who cries with you." The detectives left the room shaken, their notes heavy with details too painful to release to the public. For Rachel's family, only the broad strokes would ever be shared. Calvin had admitted his role. His DNA was indisputable, and Rachel's final hours were known at last. Behind closed doors, however, the unreleased details painted a darker portrait than the community could bear. The story of a man who had hidden in plain sight, whose one careless drop of blood would one day bring him down. The interrogation ended not with an outburst, but with Calvin's chilling calm. "You'll never understand," he said quietly, leaning back in his chair. "But you caught me because I let you. Part of me wanted it over." The detectives walked out, their expressions drawn. For them, this was no victory dance. It was the end of a nightmare, yes, but one that left behind scars as permanent as the DNA that had cracked the case wide open. The news of Calvin Brooks' arrest spread across Riverton like a storm breaking over the plains. For 2 decades, the town had carried Rachel Monroe's absence like a wound that never healed. Candlelight vigils, weathered flyers taped to telephone poles, and quiet prayers whispered at church pews had become part of the fabric of life here. Now, for the first time, there was something beyond silence. Answers. For Rachel's mother, Diane, the call came just after midnight. She had lived with her phone on her nightstand for 20 years, a habit born of waiting, for news, for a lead, for anything. When Detective Halstead's voice came through, steady but weighted with emotion, she knew before he spoke the words, "We got him, Diane." The tears came suddenly. Not the slow trickle of grief, but a flood that bent her body forward. For years, she had fought to keep Rachel's memory alive, to keep her daughter's name from fading into an unsolved headline. Now her grief found a companion in relief. "I can finally tell her we didn't stop. she whispered to her sister, who had rushed to her side. In the days that followed, Riverton held its breath. At a press conference, the sheriff's office confirmed what many had long feared but could not prove. Rachel was never simply missing. She had been taken, harmed, and hidden by someone they all thought they knew. Calvin's name struck like lightning. He had been at every search. He had stood shoulder to shoulder with volunteers, wearing a cap pulled low, his expression grim. He had even brought casseroles to Diane's door, his words soft with sympathy. The betrayal stung deeply. As one neighbor said, "It's like finding out the devil lived next door, and we all broke bread with him." With the arrest came a reopening of physical searches, too. Calvin, in his guarded confession, had led investigators to the remote patch of riverbank where he said Rachel's remains were left. The ground was harsh and unforgiving, the river shifting over 2 decades. But cadaver dogs quickly alerted near a grove of cottonwoods. Beneath the soil, fragments surfaced: a child's shoelace, faded pink fabric, bone. For Diane, standing nearby under the support of detectives, it was both agony and peace. She had imagined this moment for years, the recovery of her daughter. Yet no mother dreams of cradling a shoelace in place of a child. Still, she said softly, "She's coming home." The town held another vigil, but this one felt different. The candles weren't lit in desperation, but in honor. Photos of Rachel lined the tables, her freckled cheeks, her wide smile, the drawings she had made in 5th grade. Friends who were children then now came as adults with their own kids, carrying with them the memory of the girl who vanished on an ordinary September day. Pastor William, who had presided over the vigil since 2001, spoke words that echoed in the crisp night air. "Tonight we light not to search, but to remember. Tonight we know where Rachel is, and we know the truth no darkness could hide forever." The closure rippled beyond Riverton. Across Wyoming and the nation, true crime watchers who had followed Rachel's story for years shared in the moment. Online forums lit up with messages of sorrow, of outrage, of relief that technology had finally given voice to a child silenced too soon. But closure was complicated. For Diane and her son Matthew, now in his 30s, the arrest and recovery brought new grief alongside the old. "I grew up without my sister," Matthew told a local reporter, "and I'll never get that back. But knowing where she is, it's the first time I've felt like I can breathe." Detective Halstead, speaking privately to the family, admitted the case had been the most personal of his career. "I promised you we'd never stop," he told Diane, his voice breaking for the first time in years. "And we didn't. Rachel brought us here." As Rachel's remains were laid to rest in the family plot, the cemetery filled with mourners from every corner of the town. White balloons floated into the Wyoming sky, drifting above the Wind River Range, carrying with them 20 years of sorrow, relief, and remembrance. For Riverton, the closure was not just about Rachel. It was a reminder that evil can wear familiar faces, that silence can last for years, but that truth, once found, reshapes everything. Parents held their children tighter. Neighbors greeted one another with cautious warmth. And through it all, Rachel's name became more than the symbol of a mystery. It became a legacy of resilience, of a community that refused to forget. In the quiet after the funeral, Diane visited Rachel's room, untouched for years. On the dresser sat her daughter's favorite book, its spine frayed from countless readings. She opened it, placed the recovered shoelace inside, and whispered, "We found you, sweetheart. You can rest now." And with that, after 2 decades of unanswered questions, Riverton finally began to heal. The courtroom in Fremont County was packed to the walls on the first day of State of Wyoming versus Calvin Brooks. Locals who had lived in Riverton for decades, who remembered searching the fields with flashlights and stringing Rachel Monroe's face across every telephone pole, sat shoulder to shoulder with reporters from Cheyenne, Denver, and even national outlets. After 22 years, the case that haunted a town was finally coming to trial. The prosecution's opening statement wasted no time in painting Calvin as the man who hid in plain sight. He joined the search parties. He knocked on Mrs. Monroe's door with food. And all the while, he knew where Rachel was. The district attorney thundered. Behind him, a projector displayed the evidence. Photos of the green pickup truck. Calvin's DNA profile matched against the sample found on Rachel's coat. The shoelace unearthed by cadaver dogs. The defense countered with a strategy built on doubt. They acknowledged the tragedy but urged the jury to question the chain of custody and the reliability of touch DNA from an item buried for 20 years. This evidence sat in a box for decades, the defense attorney said, gesturing toward the file stacked on the prosecution's table. How can you convict a man on fragments and theories? The trial stretched for weeks. Witnesses revisited painful memories, their voices trembling but steady. Rachel's childhood friend Chloe took the stand, recounting the sight of Rachel walking toward the park, her pink backpack swaying. I never thought it'd be the last time I saw her, she said, clutching tissues as the courtroom fell silent. Forensic experts explained the science that made the breakthrough possible. A state lab analyst walked the jury through the new technology that extracted and amplified degraded DNA from Rachel's coat. Charts and digital graphics illuminated the process, showing how the male DNA profile connected to Calvin Brooks, with what the analyst described as a statistical probability so high it excludes all others. Perhaps the most chilling testimony came from detectives who described Calvin's own words in interrogation. He hadn't confessed outright, but he had slipped into inconsistencies. He claimed he had never been near the park, yet phone tower records from 2001 placed his pickup circling the area. He said he didn't know Rachel personally, yet a journal recovered from his home revealed references to the little blonde girl with the dog. The words struck like ice through the gallery. Diane Monroe attended every session, her face composed, her hands folded in her lap. Matthew sat beside her, jaw clenched, his eyes rarely leaving Calvin. To them, this wasn't just a trial. It was the closing of a circle. When the defense called Calvin himself to the stand, the courtroom stilled. He appeared smaller than he had at the time of his arrest, his voice low, his words laced with denial. I didn't take Rachel, he repeated. I didn't kill anyone. I'm not that man. But when the prosecutor pressed him about the shoelace fibers in his truck and the DNA that tied him to Rachel's coat, his evasive answers only deepened the silence in the room. Closing arguments came down to one theme: trust. The prosecution argued that the community's trust had been exploited by Calvin, who lived among them while hiding his crime. The defense urged the jury to trust the principle of reasonable doubt. If there's even a shadow of uncertainty, the defense lawyer said, you cannot convict. The jury deliberated for 2 days, a wait that frayed nerves and stretched time. Reporters lingered outside the courthouse. Inside, Diane and Matthew held on to each other, their prayers silent but fervent. At last, the verdict was read. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Calvin Brooks, guilty. The words landed like a gavel striking the soul of Riverton. Diane wept openly, clutching her son. Matthew lowered his head into his hands, shoulders shaking. Across the room, gasps broke into muffled sobs. Some whispered prayers of thanks, others simply sat stunned. After 22 years, justice had been spoken aloud. Calvin showed little reaction, only a tightening of the jaw. The judge sentenced him to life without parole, calling the crime a calculated act of cruelty against a child and a community. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as Diane spoke briefly to reporters. Her voice was steady despite her tears. We waited more than 2 decades for this moment. Rachel was loved. She was never forgotten. Today we finally have justice for her. For Riverton, the verdict closed a chapter that had been open far too long. Residents who had once walked those search grids in 2001 now hugged each other in relief. The case that once cast a shadow over every playground and park bench had ended with truth, accountability, and the enduring reminder that even time cannot bury justice forever. In the days following the verdict, Riverton felt different. For 2 decades, the absence of Rachel Monroe had been a wound too raw to speak of openly, and yet too present to ever ignore. Now, as autumn leaves once again swept across the Wind River Range, there was a sense that something long suspended in the air had finally settled. Rachel's name no longer appeared only in unsolved case files or on fading flyers taped to lampposts. It appeared in headlines across the state, on social media posts shared thousands of times, and in the quiet conversations of neighbors who could finally say her name without lowering their voices. Justice had come, not on the timeline anyone had hoped for, but in a way that reaffirmed a truth long whispered in vigils. She was never forgotten. For Diane and Matthew Monroe, life would never return to what it once was. Rachel's laughter, her blonde hair catching the late Wyoming sun, her small hand tucked into her mother's, All of it remained locked in memory. But in the courthouse and in the days that followed, Diane began to speak not only about loss, but also about legacy. Rachel deserved to grow up, she told a local reporter. We can't give her back her years, but we can make sure her story protects other children. That vision became the Rachel Monroe Foundation, a nonprofit Diane and Matthew established within a year of the verdict. Its mission was clear: to provide safety education for children, to support families of missing persons, and to fund the advancement of forensic technology in rural counties where budgets were often too thin. The foundation held its first candlelight vigil in the Riverton town square the following September, on the anniversary of Rachel's disappearance. Hundreds attended, holding flickering candles against the night sky, whispering her name. The case also reshaped law enforcement in Wyoming. Detectives who had once worked Rachel's file expressed how this outcome proved the importance of preserving evidence, no matter how cold the trail may seem. A single thread of DNA, a tiny fiber. It can change everything 20 years later, one officer said. As a result, Fremont County invested in better storage facilities for evidence and new training for officers on cold case preservation. For the community, the lesson was both sobering and hopeful. Sobering because the betrayal had come from someone in their midst, a man who smiled at barbecues and nodded at church. Hopeful because the relentless pursuit of truth, through science, persistence, and community memory, had finally revealed what happened to Rachel. Riverton schools began holding annual assemblies about child safety and trust, using Rachel's story not as a tale of fear but as a call to vigilance. Teachers reminded students, your voice matters. If something feels wrong, speak up. Diane attended many of these talks, her presence both heartbreaking and inspiring. She told students, Rachel was like you. She wanted to be a teacher. She loved her little dog. She should be here today. Let her story remind you that your safety is precious. The broader impact of the case rippled outward too. Advocacy groups pointed to Rachel's case as proof of how genetic genealogy and forensic advancements could revive stalled investigations. Other families with missing children clung to that hope, believing that if Riverton could see justice after 22 years, so could they. Yet, amid the changes, the Monroe family remained grounded in one central truth. Rachel's life was not defined by her death. She was remembered for her smile, her kindness, her love of coloring books, and the way she once declared she wanted to teach kids how to read like Mom. Her grave, marked with fresh flowers each week, became less a place of sorrow and more a place of reflection, a reminder of resilience, love, and a community's promise to never give up. As Riverton moved forward, the legacy of Rachel Monroe stood as both a warning and a beacon. Evil can lurk in familiar places, but justice, though delayed, can still rise. The trial had closed one chapter, but Rachel's name continued to write others: scholarships for students, improved cold case protocols, and a foundation that would protect countless children in her memory. And in the quiet evenings, when the wind from the mountains swept across town, people often recalled the candlelight vigils where voices rose in unison, a chorus of light against darkness. Rachel's story reminds us all: no case is too old, no truth too buried, no memory too fragile to fade. Late justice is still justice, and the act of remembering, the refusal to let silence win, is a legacy stronger than time. For those listening now, we invite you to carry Rachel's story forward. Share her name, honor her light, and join in supporting families still waiting for answers. Because every child, every person deserves safety, truth, and remembrance. And if stories like this move you, if they remind you of the importance of seeking justice no matter how long it takes, we invite you to stay with us, subscribe, share, and continue walking with us through these journeys of loss, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Because as Riverton has shown, even after 22 years, justice can still be found. And Rachel Monroe's light, though gone too soon, will never fade.